So it looks like the battle for Tripoli is still raging on. The tide seems to have turned since I last addressed the topic, however. Last time when I discussed the battle, it was just getting started, but it didn't look like either side were doing particularly well. The LNA forces, the forces of Khalifa Haftar, were not particularly making strong advances into the city. There were a couple airports that changed hands a couple times, but nobody, neither the LNA nor the GNA, seemed to be getting the upper hand in the battle. However, that's no longer the case, as the GNA now seems to have pushed Haftar's forces south of Tripoli, which I'm sure the European Union is quite happy about. Earlier this week, the EU was very concerned that Haftar's attack on Tripoli was affecting not only Libyans, but African migrants who were in Tripoli trying to get to Europe. Apparently, the EU is very interested in taking in as many migrants as possible, because they were essentially treating these people like they were already citizens, and were very upset that Haftar would, that his war could possibly harm them. But now the migrants seem to be safe, now that the fighting has been pushed south into the suburbs of Tripoli. I'm sure this is pretty disappointing, and Haftar doesn't want to retreat at this point, considering that he's sunk so much capital into this offensive. And frankly, I'm surprised that the GNA has held up this well, considering that their forces are pretty much a band of ragtag militias. I mean, all the video that I was seeing coming out of Tripoli over the last couple weeks depicting the GNA quote-unquote soldiers was rather disconcerting. You know, they were just kind of guys in flip-flops and shorts and tank tops walking around with AKs and PKMs and driving tanks in circles and not really doing anything that was well thought out strategically. So I would have figured that Haftar's forces would have wiped the floor with these gentlemen by now. So despite an injection of tens of millions of dollars reportedly in cash by Saudi Arabia, Haftar still hasn't been able to break through. Part of that, it seems to me, and again, we're working with limited information, it seems to me that Haftar's forces failed to achieve air superiority in this battle, because I have been seeing quite a few aircraft being shot down from both sides. Seems to me that there's a combination here of the militias having more air power than I would have expected, and Haftar having less than I would have expected. Each side simply seems to have a few fighter jets that they've been scrambling around, and they've been using them just for real low-altitude passes, trying to spook the enemy and, disorient them. The Americans certainly have done that quite a bit in the Middle East. Whenever they're up against militants, they'll just have the Air Force fly a jet over them, and all the noise or whatever will spook them, and they'll try and create a sonic boom over them that'll hurt their ears and mess up and blow a bunch of wind everywhere. And both sides of the battle in Tripoli seem to have been doing the exact same thing. But of course, planes on both sides have been getting shot down pretty regularly. Of course, there's also been some reports that I saw of the Egyptian Air Force intervening on Haftar's behalf on at least one occasion. Now, so far, it seems to be about 250 to 300 people have been killed, which, considering that Haftar has been shelling in densely populated areas, that seems like a pretty good number. I would have expected far more people to be dead when you include civilian and combatant casualties. Now, of course, perhaps this is just a very low underestimate, but so far no sources that I've been reading, included sources that are not particularly favorable to Haftar, none have disputed this number. Now, you may remember that last week President Trump essentially came out during the battle and backed Haftar after a call on the phone with him. And the European Union, which does not back Haftar, is quite upset with the president over that. The EU seems to be holding out hope that perhaps Trump can still reverse his decision and decide that Haftar is in fact an evil warlord as they contend. Now, considering the tide has turned against Haftar, I think that it's quite possible that Trump could abandon him, because as we all know, Trump likes a winner. And last week, I think everyone agreed that things looked pretty good for Haftar and that he probably would win, although now the tide has turned against him and he's being pushed south. Now, I don't think that he stands a chance of being defeated outright, but he has been, for the time being, denied a clear victory. And as we all know, Trump likes strong men, And I don't just mean a strong man in the sense of a political strong man. I mean men who are strong. As he said it to about John McCain, he likes guys who weren't captured. So now that Haftar is being pushed to the south and is ostensibly losing, perhaps Trump's respect for him will erode. Now, interestingly enough, as much as the EU seems to be opposed to Haftar, they're not unified on this front. The EU is still as much of a clown show as far as their unified foreign policy goes as they ever were. Because when Federica Mogherini released her statement on the battle in Tripoli, which she did, I think, a couple days after it started, so this wasn't even an immediate statement. It took them a couple days to formulate one. She did not even mention Haftar. And you might be wondering why. Why would she just condemn violence in Tripoli, or, writ large, rather than condemning Haftar in particular, considering that the EU is supposed to be backing the government of national accord, which is defending itself from Haftar. This is apparently because the French are trying to play both sides of this issue, and they intervened in the formulation of the statement and insisted that Mogherini not openly condemn Haftar and release a more neutral statement. And you might ask, well, that doesn't make much sense. If the EU's backing the GNA, then they should release a statement backing the GNA. Well, the problem is that the EU is not much of a unified body. Every country within the EU, for the most part, but in this case Germany, Britain, and France, have their own foreign policies, and France simply has a different policy on Libya than Britain or Germany do. So therefore, if the EU is going to release a joint statement, it has to be an amalgamation of the positions of everyone in the EU, or at least an amalgamation of the important people in the EU. So meanwhile, Macron, as I mentioned, has been hedging his bets and has really been trying to play both sides of this Libya conflict because he seems to want to be friends with whoever comes out on top. Early on in his presidency, he apparently hosted joint peace talks between the leaders of the GNA and Haftar, and apparently they reached some kind of agreement that was never implemented, but this was the point of the meeting was not necessarily to fix Libya. It was to make Macron look like a strong leader who could help defuse international conflict. Because, someone like Macron, before he was president, I believe he was the finance minister, and he was a banker. So he did not have what we would call foreign policy chops. And so politicians always like to show off their quote-unquote foreign policy chops when they feel inadequate. You saw the same thing here with when they appointed Nikki Haley to be the ambassador to the United Nations. The reason why they were doing that is because they were grooming her to be president, but she had been a state governor, and state governors deal with domestic issues. So they put her at the UN where she could make all sorts of bloviating statements about how much she loves Israel and wars, and now she's on the board of directors of Boeing. This is just how politics works. So for Macron, becoming a friend of Haftar's was just a part of his growing as a politician. And of course, back in the U.S., there doesn't seem to be a unified front in Washington in favor of Haftar. Trump pretty much went this on his own. Lindsey Graham, the chronic warmonger and the longtime ally and friend of John McCain, is very much in favor of the GNA government and wants Trump to come down very hard against the Saudis and the Emiratis and tell them that their proxy war in Tripoli is not to be tolerated. However, from what I understand, Lindsey Graham has no problem supporting a Saudi and Emirati-backed proxy war in Yemen. Now, my guess is that it's because Libya is purely a Sunni country and that there are no Shiites in Libya, so Lindsey Graham, I guess, is not concerned unless he can see the specter of Iran on the horizon. But I think that's about it for this update on Libya, so if you got any value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and subscribing. And if you do subscribe, make sure to click the bell, because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss the next one. I'm not sure when I'll come back to Libya, whenever there's new news, but I do follow foreign policy topics quite closely, so please do stay tuned.